Well, thank you very much, Pablo, and it's a pleasure to be back. I was fortunate to give a talk here about a previous book, Calling the Masses, about 4 years ago, and to meet Giuseppe and spend some time with Pablo. So it's wonderful to be back here. The book has been published, as you can see, but I continue to work on these issues. I'm working on a new book project on refugee policy, and so your feedback today will be very useful, not only in telling me what I have done wrong in the past, but in terms of next steps for research. So, what I would like to talk today, it's very topical, but I'm hoping to give a comparative and historical look at an issue of how governments in the rich democracies of the global north try to keep asylum seekers away from their territories in a way that you wouldn't get simply from reading the newspapers. When you think about border control, typically, we think about physical manifestations of borders. And this is the border between Mexico and the United States as it looks from Tijuana, Mexico, looking into San Diego, California, where I live. And obviously under the presidency of Donald Trump, there's a lot of talk about the wall. And we can find an increase in border fortifications around the world that have been charted by a number of different human geographers systematically. And as important as these are, though, much more important in terms of constraining mobility are various techniques of remote control. And so this project seeks to lay out and make visible policies and institutions that are often invisible or much less visible. So this is not a new idea. There are a number of different scholars who have talked in very generative ways about the idea of remote control. That particular term in the context of migration comes from the late Aristide Zolberg, writing about this in 1997. But a number of different scholars across the social sciences and the study of law have also used slightly different terms. We could talk about these at length, but the main point I just would like to make for now is that they've all been paying attention to the way that space is used deliberately by governments to keep out asylum seekers and other unwanted migrants. Continue to go. So these are various variations of this. There are some variations of this are more concrete than others. There's a whole other set of work, mostly in critical border studies and anthropology, that uses some rather ephemeral language to talk about border control, the idea that the border is now everywhere or that the border is nowhere, as we have more electronic databases that control movement and focus on individual level movements. But I insist on the importance of really specifying space in border control and in migration control for several different reasons. So what's at stake in being serious about the specification of space? First of all, there are a set of policy and political issues to deal with, and then there are also some more abstract theoretical issues. At a policy level, I think it's important because we are often asked, why don't asylum seekers or why don't irregular migrants simply do it the legal way? Why don't they simply get in line? If you were really a refugee, for example, why would you sneak across the border? I think it's a legitimate question, and there's a real answer to that question. And remote control is the main answer to that question. The fact that for fewer than 1% of the world's refugees is a resettlement option available historically. That number would be even less today under the Trump administration. And governments systematically try to shut down other legal paths using techniques that I'll be talking about in detail. Second, I think it's important to take space seriously because from the perspective of parliamentary or judicial oversight over the actions of the executive or what non-state actors do to try to restrain the actions of states in this area, it makes a huge difference exactly where in space these kinds of controls are being deployed. And then thirdly, I think it's important to think about this from the perspective of figuring out how effective are states at controlling unwanted migration. In sociology, I'm a sociologist by training, although I trespass on neighboring disciplines. There's generally quite a bit of skepticism about the ability of states to control migration. If you look at the major surveys by Cornelius and Sasson and Massey and many others, they're very skeptical about whether or not states can actually keep people from moving when they're not wanted. But to really know that, you would have to look at these forms of remote control rather than simply trying to measure attempted crossings across a given border. Then I think it's important from a more abstract perspective to think about changes over the longue durée in control over mobility. And here I'm very much in dialogue with the work of John Torpy, whose book on the invention of the passport is extremely important in this field. There's a second edition out, which I would recommend to all of you as well. And there he makes the argument that certainly over it starts a little bit earlier, but mostly over the 19th century, that there was a movement in various kinds of state forms of mobility control, and the major movement is that the institution of states monopolize the legitimate means of movement. And here he's obviously building on a long tradition from Max Weber. And when he's talking about monopolizing the legitimate means of movement, he's talking about the state taking the power to control movement away from private actors such as feudal lords or slave owners or employers of indentured servants, other kinds of private actors. And so I think that he's right about that. But what's interesting is that even if the state as an institutional form continues to monopolize the legitimate means of movement's control, the actual practice is not monopolized by a given state, and that more and more we see shared coercion over the control of mobility. So we'll be talking about some specific ways that happens. Then finally, and this is probably the bulk of what I'm going to be talking about, is I think that understanding the role of space in remote control is important because it shows how organizations, specifically governments in this instance, explicitly will agree to particular norms and will inscribe those norms into their laws. And so in a narrow sense, they are complying with those norms and those laws, and yet they systematically try to evade the spirit that underlies those norms and those laws. So this is not a story of compliance. There's a huge literature on why and to what extent the states comply with international law, for example. This is a different story. It's not about narrow compliance. It's about evasions that stay within the black letter of the law, arguably, and yet violate the spirit of those laws. Okay, so here I'm drawing on some lesser known work that is done by Alejandro Portes and his colleagues on what they call the Hippocratic bubble. So briefly, the idea of the Hippocratic bubble is that the oath that's attributed to Hippocrates that all physicians take requires them to render medical assistance to people in need. Well, they're looking at the instance of healthcare in the United States, where famously there is not universal healthcare. So what they find is that there is a bubble around the Hippocratic Oath. There is a physical control of the space around the physician's examination room to control, limit the kinds of sick and wounded people who are able to come into the space of the physician. Sometimes there is a hard edge to this control. You might have armed security guards at the entrance to the hospital. More often, it's a softer face of control and selection. You have these smiling clerks that ask for your documents, your insurance card, and so forth before they let you in. And the effect is to have a norm that really means something. This is not a facade. If you can enter the space of the physician in that room, you probably will be treated, but you have all of these different strategies that are used to limit who's able to get into that space to activate the norm. And I think this is a useful idea to think about asylum as well. So there is a general principle that undergirds the international asylum regime, the principle of non-refoulement, that refugees will not be returned into the hands of the persecutors. And this is a strongly institutionalized norm. There are 148 states that are parties to that definition and the UN Refugee Convention and/or its protocol from 51 and 67. There's an even stronger, in some ways, principle of non-refoulement in the Convention Against Torture from 1984, with even more states party that prohibits refoulement of anyone who faces torture, regardless of why they would face torture. So it's a norm that really does mean something. But again, to be able to activate the norm, you have to get into that space. So what do states do to try to evade their obligations that they've explicitly accepted? Well, they manipulate territoriality in a couple of different ways. The first way is remote control, or pushing border control out, the extra-territorialization that authors have spoken of, and I'll talk about a lot of details of that in a moment. But very importantly, simultaneously as states are projecting their border control hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away from their borders, they're also making these hyper-territorial distinctions down to the meter, even down to the centimeter, right at their border line. And I'm not exaggerating when I talk about centimeters, and I'll show you a couple of examples. The first comes from where I live on the Mexico-US border. So right now there are agents of the US government and or the private security guards that they have hired, but that are doing the work of the government, all along this border, which is clearly marked out down to the centimeter as to exactly where Mexico ends and the US begins. And what they're doing is to control access to that borderline so that you cannot even step your toe onto US soil until you first show that you have either a US passport or you have a US visa. So this is the border. I just crossed this border 2 days ago. So this is the border right here. This little metal line continues. And this didn't use this is something from the Trump administration. So these people on the right with the baby and the carriage, they're trying to enter the US. You see the agents with their feet right on the borderline. And this is a preliminary check. If someone shows they have a visa, that's not the end of the story. They would go in to the border control area, and some meters away, then there's a more thorough revision, potentially a secondary revision. But this idea is specifically to keep out asylum seekers. This is specifically asylum seekers, because once someone touches their toe right here, they have a whole range of rights that they didn't have when their toe was right here. And this is not simply a story of asylum. There have been a number of cases, for example, of cross-border shootings that highlight the importance of what legal scholars call territorial rights of personhood. Rights that people have, in the case of the US, by virtue of the US Constitution, that they have simply by their territorial presence on US soil, regardless of their legal status or citizenship status. So in these cases of cross-border shootings, these are instances in which US agents standing on US soil have fired their weapons, the border travels, the bullet travels at high velocity across the international border, strikes someone on the other side of the border. In the cases I'm talking about, these are Mexican nationals who are not US residents, and some of them have been killed. So then the question becomes, among others, did that person who was killed have rights under the US Constitution that were potentially violated by these shootings? So these cases have been litigated. They have gone all the way to the US Supreme Court. And in one such case from, again, where I live in San Diego, Tijuana, there was an altercation between a man and a Mexican national, Jose Alfredo Yanez Reyes, and a US Border Patrol agent. The agent shot and killed him, and his body fell where you see it here, blacked out in his face. This is the border fortification fence on the right. So the US government hired a surveyor to find out exactly where this person fell in relation to the border. And the surveyor drew this yellow line, this is one of the court exhibits, through the man's body. And the government's position was that, well, it's true that his legs are on the US side of the border, but he died of a head wound and his head fell on the Mexican side of the border, therefore he did not have rights under the US Constitution. So when I talk about this hyper-territorialization in terms of centimeters, I'm talking about this. You can see these are in fractions of an inch, or the measurements. Okay, so the system of remote control is not new. And much of the literature, to be honest, the main academic literature on this topic misleadingly claims that this is a set of technologies that began in the 1980s or 90s. It's just not true. If you go back and look at this historical record, every single major technique of remote control was first deployed to bottle up Jews fleeing fascism in Europe and to prevent them from reaching mandatory Palestine or the liberal European countries or the Americas. I won't go into all of these now. I won't read all these strategies that are on the board, but there's a whole long section in the book about this. So what we have is, in some ways, with a lot of precedent, but there is something new under the sun. And what's new under the sun is that there is a global system of remote control now, whereas before those were strategies, there were ad hoc strategies targeting one particular group, Jewish people trying to flee fascism. Now we have a global system that affects all kinds of people who are moving. There's what I call an architecture of repulsion that is meant to control everyone and to repel those who are unwanted. And so I deliberately use medieval metaphors of castle building to render visible these strategies that are often invisible. It's a global system to the extent that there is a shared template, a converging template among all of the countries that I'm looking at for this project, and it's focusing on the US, Canada, the European Union, and Australia. Although if you look at what they're doing in partnership with other countries, it expands to many other countries. But there's a convergence of policies, there's a sharing of knowledge about best or, depending on your political perspective, worst practices. There's a lot of funding that is used to build up the capacity of other states, sharing of data about individual travelers as well as groups of travelers, training, equipment, and so forth. So it's truly become a global system in a way that departs from the 1930s. Undergirding all of these systems of remote control is the files. So the files are not new either. The files have been around for about 100 years. We often naturalize the idea that if we travel to another country, we need a passport, and that for many countries, we need a visa before we get there. But the whole system of visa controls is only about 100 years old. It's an artifact of the First World War, which was a time of exceptional national security needs. The World War I ended a long time ago, but that system is still with us. And that's a common feature of many features of this regime, that it grew out of particular historical context, often out of responses to perceived crises, but the system has accreted over time. Many of the features of remote control predate the whole refugee regime. And their origins are distinct from the control of refugees, but they have a strong impact, and often a disproportionate impact on the control of refugees. Biometric databases, in some ways, began more than 100 years ago. If you think about techniques of bertillonnage and photographs and so on, they've become more sophisticated. What's important now is that those are all shared, along with records of entry and exit. If you are crossing an international border and you have the opportunity to peek behind the agent's screen and see what they see, usually it's difficult, but it's instructive. Often you'll see all kinds of interesting information about where you have been. And what's interesting about that from the point of view of shared control is that that information is shared very, very widely, although asymmetrically. Okay, so the next technology is the idea of caging people up in either their country of origin or in some other sovereign territory. And there are many different techniques within caging. So one of the most obvious and the most cage-like techniques of caging, in terms of the physical caging of people, is in refugee camps. And this is a satellite image of the Zaatari refugee camp, one of the major refugee camps in Jordan. And even though encampment has become less popular around the world, the UNHCR tries not to encamp people for years and years and years. This has often been the case in the past. It still remains a major technique of control. And here the architecture of repulsion is the same as the architecture of protection. The same camps that are providing protection for people's lives and providing them with food and some health care over time, education, and so on. It's doing all of those humanitarian things. At the same time, is deliberately controlling people and often bottling them up so that they won't continue on to some other place. What's the other place? Clearly, the vast majority of the funding for the UNHCR comes from the rich countries of the global north, primarily historically the US, and that continues under the Trump administration for reasons that we can get into. Behind the scenes, the Trump administration will probably be actually increasing its UNHCR funding. And that's part of what some people have called a grand compromise or a grand bargain, in which the countries of the global north pay the countries of the global south to bottle up people in their regions of origin so that they won't continue on, in return for funding and some symbolic resettlements. The hardest face of caging is military intervention. There are many examples since the 1990s of powerful militaries explicitly intervening in a foreign country with at least one of the stated goals being to prevent large flows of refugees from reaching the global north. So you can think about the Balkans, you can think about Haiti, and the Libyan intervention, there are others. The Australian government has an idiosyncratic solution to their perceived problem of irregular maritime asylum seekers passing through mostly Indonesia, trying to reach Australia, which has been so-called offshore processing in two sovereign countries, the world's smallest island republic, the Republic of Nauru, and Manus Island, which is part of Papua New Guinea. What's unusual about this offshore processing is that the people who've been sent there, by the way, almost all of them who've gone through refugee status determination have been found to be refugees and meet the legal standard. What's unusual is that they didn't pass through those countries on their way to Australia. It's also unusual that they were found to be refugees and yet are de facto detained either in a camp or on an island indefinitely, and that they're in another country's sovereign territory, although de facto it's the Australian government that's paid for and controlled that process. This has been an idea that's also been bandied about in other contexts. The Danes have been talking about this since the 1980s. Every time there's a perceived refugee crisis in Europe, this is talked about. So far it hasn't been developed in any kind of serious way, but we can talk more about that in the Q&A. Okay, the softest form of caging is using propaganda campaigns, publicity campaigns of dissuasion. All of the governments that I'm talking about do this. This is an example from an Australian graphic novel that was distributed in Afghanistan, and it tells the story of evidently a Hazara man who leaves Afghanistan trying to get to Australia. He's been swindled by the smugglers. He doesn't realize that there is now no way to reach Australia. If you arrive by sea without a visa, he's taken to this godforsaken island for detention, and in the final panel, he's here dreaming of the fiesta back in Afghanistan, wishing that he was still with his family. Then there are legal tools, and there's a lot of talk right now in the United States in particular about these legal tools which were originally developed in the European context of country of origin designations, which are basically a rebuttable presumption that if someone is a national of a particular country, that they will not be considered a refugee. And in the book I rely on documents that were released through State Watch showing the discussions behind the scenes among European governments about which countries should be on that list, and has very little bearing with actual conditions in those countries in response to all kinds of foreign policy and domestic policy preferences. Okay, the next strategy is an aerial dome over the continents that I'm talking about. Almost all of the strategies of the aerial dome are based on controls over passengers arriving by sea, many of which have been largely forgotten. And again, the standard literature on this topic really misrepresents the timing of these things. The carrier sanctions regime of giving fines to shipping companies that transport people who are inadmissible and requiring them to take the passenger back to their point of disembarkation, or sorry, of embarkation. That's a very old regime. You can find scattered incidents of that in Europe going back to the medieval period, but in a way, all of these settler societies that I'm talking about, US, Canada, Australia, had pretty strong sanctions regimes going back to the 19th century. All of these countries also have, and the EU also have carrier liaison officers, which are stationed in foreign airports and give advice to the airlines about whom to allow onto the plane and whom to exclude. In general, they don't collect statistics on even how many people are excluded. They don't have the legal authority to do anything, but because of the carrier sanctions regime, obviously the airlines do the bidding of these liaison officers. And so even a place like Australia or Canada, mid-sized powers have networks of these agents all across the globe in the major airports. Then the US has an idiosyncratic program, the pre-clearance program with Canada. On paper, it could be truly two-way, but in practice, this is exclusively people who are trying to reach the US, and they are cleared into the US by US agents exercising passport and customs control on the soil of a foreign airport. And about 15% of arriving US international air passengers have been pre-cleared abroad. This is a system that goes back to the Toronto airport in 1952. Most major Canadian airports, some trains, ferries, have this arrangement with the US. It extends to some other places as well. So for example, Abu Dhabi. When you fly from Abu Dhabi to New York, which I did last year, oddly enough, in Abu Dhabi, you're talking to US agents, you're showing your passport, you're doing all of this. And so that when you arrive at JFK, you walk off as if you had just arrived from Boston. Now, from the point of view of asylum, this is important because the US plays with jurisdiction. The US government plays with jurisdiction. The Department of Justice has prosecuted people for violating US law and those pre-clearance spaces in foreign airports. For example, in the Caribbean, they've prosecuted people for smuggling drugs through those spaces, but you cannot apply for asylum in those spaces. So the government turns its jurisdiction on and off, depending on its interests. Okay, then we have the system of control in waterways, the moats. The image here is from a US multi-agency task force which is doing contingency planning, imagining a large flow of people leaving the Caribbean, heading for Florida, as happened, for example, in 1980, and the Mariel boat lift between Cuba and the US. And here you see the talons of Sam the Eagle coming down over the Dominican Republic and Haiti and Cuba. The scale of interceptions that the US Coast Guard has carried out since the beginning of its migrant interception program under the Reagan administration is huge. We're talking about 250,000 people until the Coast Guard took these statistics down from its website in the Trump administration. So what's happening now is unknown. And you can see that many nationalities have been involved, but primarily the program has been used to intercept Haitians and Cubans. So we don't know how many of the people in this graph would sociologically be considered refugees or would be legally considered refugees, or how many wanted to apply for asylum or some other humanitarian status. But many of them would be. And much of the logic of intercepting people very far away from the US coast is to keep them from having access to US courts by reaching the beach in the United States. Now, very importantly, when this program started under the Reagan administration, it was targeting Haitians. And explicitly, the executive order that started the program said that the United States would follow the 1967 protocol to the UN Refugee Convention. In other words, it would not refoul people even if they were on the high seas, even if they were outside of US territorial waters, that the US would respect the 67 protocol as well as its instantiation in the 1980 Refugee Act. So it was brought into domestic law in that act. But in 1992, you see there's a large movement out of primarily Haiti, and the presidency of George H. Bush changed the rules of the game. And in the so-called Kennebunkport memo said that the US would now consider the issue of refoulement in the high seas to be a matter of discretion, but that the US was, in its interpretation, not bound by international or domestic law in the question of refoulement from outside of US territory, including US territorial waters. So this issue went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the administration. That basically gave the executive carte blanche to do what it wants on the high seas, even though the justices very explicitly said, we understand that this policy is designed as an end run around the non-refoulement obligations in US law and its treaties. Sociologically, it's interesting that even though the judiciary has given the executive carte blanche, there have been some forms of asylum screening at sea, which I've never met an asylum lawyer who thought that those forms of screening are adequate by any legal measure, but sociologically it's interesting that they exist at all. What you have for all but 2 nationalities, I'll talk about in a moment, is the so-called shout test, in the terms of Bill Frelick of Human Rights Watch. And the shout test is that if you were intercepted by the US Coast Guard, as this group of Haitian nationals was in 1992, you're on the deck of the Coast Guard cutter, and you started to make a fuss and said, hey, don't send me back. If you send me back to Haiti, I'm going to be persecuted because of my political opinion or my membership in a particular social group. Then there would be a perfunctory screening in these conditions in front of everyone else, including the security force stooges and spies and so forth. And if you pass that initial credible fear interview, you'd be taken now to the US Naval Station at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba for further screening. But deliberately, the Coast Guard has trained its personnel not to interact with people in these situations, except for what is necessary to provide life-saving medical treatment, give food and water, and get people on and off the boat. It's a see no evil, hear no evil kind of policy, which I think is emblematic of a broader configuration of not wanting to see these conditions that people have come from in order to not have the obligation to provide protection. So there are 2 nationalities, though, that have greater protections. The first is Chinese nationals who are administered a 4-part questionnaire as to why they left and what would happen if they returned. The reason that Chinese have this special exception has everything to do with US policy towards China and the fallout of the Tiananmen massacre and the politics of reproductive rights in the US as well as in China. More importantly, in the sense that it affects many, many, many more people, is the policy towards Cubans. And I'm going to talk for a minute about this because it's exceptionally important from the perspective of hyper-territorialization, and also because even a lot of the academic literature misrepresents the policies for Cubans between the mid-1990s and the last few days of the Obama administration in January 2017. So Cubans were under what's called the wet foot, dry foot policy popularly, but there is no wet foot, dry foot law. This is a set of practices that you can get if you cobble together a statute and an Immigration and Naturalization Service memo and a bilateral treaty and some informal practices. If you put all of that together, this is what you get between the mid-90s and January 2017. So the wet foot part of the policy, and this is the part of the policy that continues to this day, is that beginning in the mid-1990s, the Cuban government finally agreed to accept the repatriation of its nationals who had been intercepted by the US. Prior to that, in very few cases would the Cuban government agree to the repatriation of its own nationals. Not part of the bilateral agreement, but part of US practice is that for Cuban nationals there would be a systematic screening, a thin screening, but a systematic screening in the sense that everyone from Cuba would be administered this thin screening at sea. And again, if people passed that initial credible fear interview, they would be taken to Guantanamo or some other place depending on the year outside of the mainland US for a full screening. The dry foot policy is what changed in January right as Obama was leaving, which is that in almost all cases, Cubans who reached dry US land would be paroled into the US. Parole is an idiosyncratic term here. It's different from its other uses in the law. And it doesn't actually mean admitted legally, but it means they would be let in, and if they were otherwise admissible, within a year they would end up with a permanent resident green card. Now what's interesting here is that this is not about people reaching US territory, this is about people reaching US dry land, which is a category that otherwise you can't really find in the law. Because if you reached US territorial waters and you couldn't pass this initial credible fear screening, you would still be repatriated to Cuba. So this is people who reached US dry land. So what does that mean? Well, there are a bunch of court cases which came out of these Kafkaesque scenarios around what is dry US land. So just to give you one example from 3 years ago, where a group of about 20 Cubans reached this lighthouse in the Florida Keys, the little islands off the coast of Florida. Everybody agrees that this lighthouse was in US territorial waters. And there was about this much water between the bottom of the lighthouse and the reef. So the lawyers of this group of people who were based in Miami made the claim in court that they had reached dry US land. They're up here. You can see this is an image taken from the TV helicopter. You can see a group of people up there. They have electricity, they can watch TV, they can sit around on the couch. It seems dry enough. This is US Coast Guard vessel, and there's a bigger one nearby, which eventually took the people off while their case was going through the courts. And the judge decided that this doesn't count for dry US land because to get from here, you might be dry standing there, but to get from here to the beach, you would have to swim. So they were repatriated except for a few who passed their credible fear interview, were found to be asylum seekers according to US law, but were not resettled to the US because the US government wants to deter this kind of activity. So they were sent to Australia in return for the US resettling people who had tried to reach Australia but who were being held in Nauru. So these two countries have secretly come to this kind of agreement to comply with their asylum obligations, but to still try to deter other people from doing it by sending them literally to the other side of the world from where they want to go. Okay, so as we know, this is no surprise to people in this room, I'm sure, who work on migration. European solution has been somewhat different, and because of the unique supranational characteristics, particularly of the European Court of Human Rights, to which all EU member states are part of under its jurisdiction, that when the Italian government began refouling people trying to cross the central Mediterranean, in particular, the test case came from the first of Somali nationals. There was a lawsuit in the European Court of Human Rights, which was won by the litigants. By the way, people forget that the Germans were actually involved in that refoulement too, through Frontex. The German helicopter, part of the Frontex mission was the helicopter that identified the particular vessel that became the Hirsi Gemma case. In any event, there was a unique interpretation, the opposite of the US 1993 sale case, which was that even though this activity happened clearly in international waters, this was not in Italian territorial waters, that Italy exercised personal jurisdiction over these people at that moment. They couldn't go anywhere else. They exercised effective jurisdiction. And so as we know, the solution of the Italian government has been to pay the Libyan Coast Guard and the same militias that yesterday were smuggling people to today bottle them up under really horrific conditions of, you can see the videos if you have the stomach for it online, of outright slavery, which I don't mean in some kind of hyperbolic sense, but I mean, buying and selling people, as well as quite gruesome tortures. Okay, so I think we sometimes forget, though, as analysts, that often governments try to use these kinds of maritime controls, and we spend less time thinking about their failed policies. It's actually quite difficult for governments to find partners who are willing to do their dirty work. So, for example, the Australians were able to convince Nauru and Papua New Guinea, who really are under the Australian thumb, especially Nauru in terms of its own regional hegemony. The Australian government approached many other countries that said no. The US has approached many countries about doing processing in the Caribbean, and they've also said no. So it's important to look at both the positive and the negative cases, and I'm using positive and negative in an analytical, not a normative way. Because if the logic of maritime interception is that people can then be taken to a place where they have fewer rights. If they're taken to a place where they have the same rights as they would if they reached the beach, then there's not really a logic to those policies, which is why they've more or less disappeared in that way. Okay, so but from the perspective of understanding other forms of remote control, and particularly the collaborative forms, the shipwrighter agreements are important. The US has shipwrighter agreements with, I forget the exact number, but it's more than a couple of dozen countries in the Western Hemisphere. Spain has shipwrighter agreements with countries in West Africa, in which a single person, an official from those countries, is stationed on the US or Spanish vessel and then gives permission for, say, the Spanish vessel to enter Mauritanian waters and intercept people and conduct activities as if those were international waters. And that kind of set of agreements has been really important in terms of shared coercion. and keeping people from ever even reaching international waters. A lot of these agreements are deliberately created outside of any treaty framework because they will have less supervision from parliaments and judiciaries. So they're made as informal memoranda of understanding and so forth to allow maximum state discretion. And more recently, there have been some questions raised. It's not exactly sure if this is going to happen or not, but Frontex is purchasing a large number of drones to patrol various waterways, particularly the central Mediterranean. And so questions have been raised about what will be the obligation of Frontex or its particular member states who are operating these drones when they observe that there is a ship of people who are drowning, right? A ship is sinking, people are drowning. Will that not be a way for states to be aware of what's happening without being in the physical space with sailors in order to have the obligation to provide assistance? Will this be a way to evade the most long-standing norm in the law of the sea, which is a norm of rendering assistance to mariners in distress if it's possible to do it without putting one's own life in danger? So we'll stay tuned on that. Then the next strategy is buffers. All of the governments that I've been talking about in this study, some more than others, use their neighbors and an extended concentric ring of neighbors out to trap unwanted migrants, including asylum seekers. This has been happening for a very long time. I'll talk here I'll emphasize the US case, which might be less familiar in this regard. Even this history has been forgotten largely in the US. But the US has been very active in using Mexico as a buffer with Central America, specifically to deter refugees going back to the early 1980s. Usually it's done very quietly because this is a very sensitive issue in Mexico, which after all lost the northern half of its country to the US in various wars in the 19th century. But increasingly you can hear policymakers saying things like this from a high-ranking Department of Homeland Security official that the Guatemalan Mexico borders Guatemala, and they say that 1,000-kilometer frontier is effectively the frontier of the U.S. But the U.S. has paid for refugee camps in Mexico going back to the 1980s to bottle up mostly Guatemalan, to a lesser extent Salvadoran refugees. Also effectively pressured Mexico to put visa restrictions on Central Americans. Done all kinds of things, which I'll talk about in detail in the book, and paid for the repatriation of third country nationals, and systematically since the Merida Initiative for the last 10 years or so, paying for all kinds of equipment and training of agents in Mexico, building up the databases of the Mexican government, all in return for US access to those databases. The US has very effectively pressured the Mexican government to put restrictions on visas of 40 different nationalities around the world, and will also give the thumbs up and down on particular people trying to reach Mexico, even if their intended destination is not necessarily the US. Every single air passenger arriving in Mexico has had their information shared with the Americans, even if Mexico is their final destination. That's also true of Canada, which more people know, but in Mexico it's very sensitive, but it's also happening. I had a graduate student working in the Ministry of the Interior's offices in Mexico City on the phone with Washington, getting the thumbs up and thumbs down for people just on a regular basis. All of these countries do buffering to one extent or another. For Canada, they don't do a lot of active buffering because they have the 800-pound gorilla of the United States as their buffer, which already has a lot of capacity. So effectively, Canada is an island between its two oceans and the US. But all of these countries, they provide carrots and sticks to try to control flows. What's unusual about the Trump administration is that it's very aggressively and openly using sticks more than carrots. But the logic is pretty similar otherwise to what's been happening for a long time. There are some legal tools which include the criminalization of irregular migration. That's actually not the case in Mexico. Mexico is a case of a country it hasn't fully decriminalized, but it's taken away the imprisonment consequences of entering Mexico without authorization. There are many other countries in North Africa and in Central America and elsewhere, in Indonesia and so on, that have responded to very strong pressure from the global north to criminalize irregular migration. Well, that's by far the greater pattern. And then a lot of these countries have signed readmission agreements in which they agree to take back people who were rejected in the next state, often rejected asylum seekers, for example, and then create their own readmission agreements with countries further back the chain, all the way back to the country of origin. So in Mexico, interestingly enough, even though that's one of the most important buffer countries in the world, the border itself is basically open. That's changed a little bit in an exclusively symbolic way under the current president, AMLO. But in general, it's an open border. You can walk back and forth across that border. There are people who are taking inner tube ferries across the river openly within view of the border guards, and no one says anything. So what you have though in Mexico is what's called in Spanish a vertical frontier, where the transportation routes, the trains, the highways, the domestic flights heading towards the US have checkpoints, and racial profiling and shibboleths are used to ferret out non-Mexican nationals. And this is because Mexico has extremely weak territorial rights of personhood. It's actually in the Mexican Constitution, a clause that gives the Interior Ministry carte blanche to expel foreigners without any kind of legal process. The scale of Mexico's deportations of the three main nationalities that are relevant here, of Salvadorans, Guatemalans, and Hondurans, is huge. This is not something that just started recently, that Mexico apprehends and deports folks of these nationalities. It's more than 3.5 million of those three nationalities have been deported by the Mexican government since their campaign started around 1990. And here you can see, you can rate the relative weight of the US versus Mexico in terms of deporting those three nationalities. The blue are deportations by the Mexican government, the red deportations by the US government. Mexico, like the US, like many other countries, doesn't use crude terms like deportation or detention. There are all kinds of euphemisms, but any kind of common sense understanding, that's what's going on. All right, the final strategy that I'll talk about is the idea of a barbican. How do you say barbican in Italian, by the way? I ask because, you know, when I talk to people in the U.S., nobody thinks about castle building here. There's a castle out of every window. So I always belabor the issue in the U.S. But, you know, at least in English and Spanish, it's barbacana, it's the same thing. You know, there's often a fortified gatehouse outside the main walls of the castle, which I use as a metaphor to talk about the different techniques that governments have to make more restrictive rules right at the border of areas that are within their territorial control, but where they create special, more restrictive rules in a set of different ways. So one of them is what I call a gulag barbican. So for a time in Australia, and to this day in the case of the US, there are places that, in the case of Australia, are under Australian sovereignty. Christmas Island is part of Australia in every way. But for a while they were processing irregular maritime asylum seekers there with fewer rights of appeal, for example, than if they had been on the Australian mainland. And every other way, Christmas Island is Australia. Or there are there's spaces under the control of the US, but which are not, according to current interpretations of US law, sovereign, like the US Naval Air Station at Guantanamo Bay, which is on an indefinite long-term forced lease from Cuba. Other places too, less well known, but in the Northern Mariana Islands, where the Immigration and Nationality Act doesn't apply. So in places like Tinian and Saipan, the US has taken people there for processing explicitly because they have fewer rights than if they were in, say, Hawaii or California. Then there is, actually, if you can just go back one, the other way back. Yeah. Something else that's idiosyncratic to Australia is the idea of excision. So when irregular maritime asylum seekers started to arrive in Australia, there's a long history of it actually, but in a way that excited the public in a big way. Goes back to 2001. And the government excised the areas that you see in purple. These 3 areas in the Indian Ocean, including Christmas Island, which is there in the middle, much closer to Indonesia than the Australian mainland, and said that just for the purposes of migration documentation, that didn't count as Australia. That was not part of the so-called migration zone, that one could not ask for asylum there without the extraordinary permission of the immigration minister. He doesn't give it out. Well, not surprisingly, entrepreneurial smugglers, entrepreneurial migrants, asylum seekers started putting more fuel in the tanks and going somewhere else. So then the government excised this area in yellow. Said, well, that doesn't count for the purpose of the migration zone. And then finally, they excised the whole damn country and said that it's impossible to ask for asylum again without this extraordinary permission that's not given if you arrive by sea without a visa, so-called irregular maritime arrival. So these kind of territorial games are also used in a unique way by the Australians. Okay, then you have a kind of a classical Barbican. We can think of a number of examples. I'll just give the example of Ceuta and Melilla. So Spain's 2 enclaves in North Africa, what some people would call Europe's first overseas colonies. The Spanish government would not call it that. But so these are two enclaves with three concentric fences all the way around the enclave, separating them from Morocco. By the way, the design of these fences was first explicitly based on the U.S. border fortifications at San Diego, and has since been extended. And so here it's theoretically important because at first asylum seekers coming from the Moroccan side would climb over this first fence and land here. This is obviously Spanish territory, and ask for asylum. And then the Spanish government said, well, that doesn't count. Just to be in the first, after the first fence, you have to have crossed all 3 fences. And so then people started doing that. And then the Spanish government moved the goalpost again, and they said, no, you can only ask for asylum if you go to the asylum office. And they put 1 asylum office in each enclave in the fence. And access to the asylum office is controlled by the Moroccan border guards, who were paid by the EU. And the Moroccan border guards will not let most nationalities pass through their posts to be able to ask for asylum. So if you're from any sub-Saharan African nationality, the Moroccan border guards won't let you through. And it really does look medieval. There's now a moat financed by EU tax dollars, 2 meters deep, 4 meters wide around, and the border guards routinely have shot and often killed people trying to cross. Then there is a different kind of Barbican in which remote control really fades into borderline control. This is theoretically important because it shows, rather than the very strict line which we usually see in border control, it's this more hazy frontier zone. In some ways it's a pre-modern notion of borders. The Israeli policy that I'm referring to specifically here was of so-called hot pursuit of asylum seekers, usually from the Horn of Africa, who had crossed the Egyptian Sinai into the Israeli territory in the Negev desert. And the policy was that if they were within 50 kilometers of the border and had crossed within 24 hours, they could be pushed back without ever hearing an asylum claim. And there's some other examples from Hungary and other places. The Trump administration has tried to do something similar, which has been blocked by the courts on the southern border. And often there's a temporal limitation as well as this geographic limitation of a certain number of kilometers from the border in a certain time period. And then there's in many ways, the strangest, which we probably have also naturalized, but this idea that even if you fly into an airport in the middle of a country, that you're treated as if you're not fully in that country. So there was a very important case from Paris from 1992, the Emerald case of Syrian refugees seeking asylum in France were found to, I'm sorry, they weren't Syrian, they were Somali, but were found, let me start over. They were Somalis, they were returned from France to Syria, and in Syria, the UNHCR office in Damascus declared them to be refugees. But then there was a court case around the rights of people in these international transit zones. And the Strasbourg court ruled that people are actually in European territory, member state territory, but the principle that people have fewer rights than if they were just on the other side of the lounge door remains throughout the EU in terms of access to translators and the amount of time that you have to file appeals and so forth, what's done telephonically versus in person. So people have fewer rights in these international transit zones. And there's been a lot of attention to these, the Snowden case and a few others. Okay, so those are the techniques. What are the limits of remote control? Well, one is that we know that migrants, and I mean broadly speaking, people moving for all different kinds of reasons, including people who are fleeing violence and persecution, they have agency, they look to get around state controls. If there are an estimated 50 million unauthorized migrants in the world, many of them have effectively evaded remote controls. Some have, more or less 10 million, more or less 5 million unauthorized Mexicans in the US have simply crossed the border, so that's not about remote control, but millions of people around the world have successfully evaded these controls. Obviously something that Milena knows more than I do about. The migration industry has been around for a long time to try to help people evade these controls. Governments always blame the migration industry. You can find the British government blaming nefarious people smugglers for trying to get Jews out of Germany and Romania during World War II, actually. And so that remains a common trope today. It's difficult to control migration once the stream becomes deeply rooted in the culture and the economy and the social networks through a process of what Massey would call cumulative causation. As I mentioned earlier, also many countries, whether they're origin countries, transit countries, don't simply do the bidding of more powerful countries, even if they're in deeply asymmetrical relationships, and will sometimes try to use opening the gates to let people out as a weapon. And the bilateral relationship, the Cuban government under Fidel Castro did this quite effectively through a set of episodes with the US up until the 1990s. So these countries also have their own interests. They don't necessarily do the bidding of the more powerful. And then there are some other institutional constraints which are important, but they vary a lot by technique in terms of whether or not they're effective. So, for example, the efficacy of governments to claim that they can do whatever they really want to do when it comes to controlling the air passenger system. It's really extreme. And that's because there's a securitization of that system, which will always be there. That's not going to go away. And we don't see those who are harmed by policies that require visas and that use carrier sanctions and so forth. We don't see the people who are fleeing persecution and are never able to get a visa. We don't even know how many there are in that category. But that's really the most important single technique that affects the most people, is that part that we don't see. Whereas the courts have often been effective in constraining state actions in these Barbican spaces, because a lot of these territorial redefinitions are so blatant. There's a pretty big variation, though, across country or across case, so that the supranational constraints of the EU are unique. That really doesn't travel well. A lot of the arguments about how the judiciary constrains national governments that were developed here don't travel well even to a lot of other liberal democracies. They especially don't travel well to Australia, which does not have a Bill of Rights, where the judiciary has a long tradition of refusing to look to international law, of being extremely deferential to the executive and all things related to immigration and asylum. And there's also variation across time. What you get when you go back and look at these policies as they began in the 1930s is to see the radical reinterpretation of law. So for example, the British government was adamant that it should not, and no other government should be able to stop boats and detain passengers in international waters, even if they were just 3 miles off of their intended destination. That's something that completely has changed now, and governments are routinely stopping boats on the high seas, just as one example. So, the bottom line is that we see a convergence in the efforts of countries of the global north to limit asylum seeking through these strategies, but their ability to do it is constrained in these various ways, which continue to play out. So I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.